Thank you for listening to Classical U's podcast, for following us with our courses, training teachers, parents, school leaders on classicalu.com. On the podcast, we interview guests that are recording with us, leaders and authors that we're in conversation with related to how to run a great classroom, how to deliver the liberal arts, great books, classical languages to your students. We also have a webinar series, live learning events that is in collaboration with Schole Academy and Schole Communities. Encourage you to watch for those as well. Those are monthly, and we're delighted to have you. Thank you. Father Wesley, it's great to have you on the Classical U podcast. I am excited to introduce you and have a conversation with you. I hope it'll be wide-ranging and going across a number of different subjects, but I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to it too. I really love all the work that you do, and it's going to be great to be able to talk with you in person. Well, in person as we can get anyways. Yeah,
that's right. We're recording remotely, but we've met in person one time, at least, I think, at a conference that Dr. Anika Prather put together. Maybe other events, but I know you are a classical educator. You're a Anglican priest at St. Paul's Anglican Church in Crownsville, Maryland, graduate of the Neshoda House Theological Seminary. A couple years, 2023, is that right?
Yes, I finished in 2023, yeah.
Yep, and are on staff there as a priest at St. Paul's. You've taught Latin, logic, a number of classical subjects, some online teaching, and also in school settings. You are a co-host on two podcasts, I believe, with Junius Johnson. You guys recently just recorded talking about James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain with Dr. Anika Prather. And that podcast, everyone should look up, The Classical Mind. And then I think you're also on The Sacramentalists. Is that
That's
right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
A little more of a theological bent on that one.
Yeah. I mean, if classical Christian education and theology don't overlap, I don't know. I don't know.
That's true. As soon as I said it, I thought, well, our most recent episode of Classical Mind got pretty theological because we were talking about Go Tell It on the Mountain. So, yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's a good thing. You're married with two boys. What ages are they?
6 and 4. So the 6-year-old is in first grade this year, and our 4-year-old is he's not quite in school yet, so he's home. My wife works part-time at the school where our other son goes, so the days that she's working, he hangs out, our younger one hangs out with me, and then the days where I'm at church and she's not working, he hangs out with her, so he's getting one last kind of go-round before he'll start junior kindergarten next year, so yeah, we're excited about that.
Very good. Well, I'm doing something slightly unusual. I typically, just confine my podcast episodes with the Classical U show here to presenters. But Junius Johnson has recorded a lot of content with us, and you and I had some great conversations when we crossed paths a little bit at a recent conference that Dr. Prather had put together. So lots of mutual contacts, and your interest in Hugh of St. Victor. There's a long list of topics. So I really enjoy just having conversations with other classical educators and kind of cross-pollinating in this way. So I appreciate your time. And I'd love to start with the topic of your main area, kind of academic interest and technical expertise, I think, which is Hugh of St. Victor. And what are some of the highlights that you think classical educators should, not miss out on, fail to be aware of as classical educators as far as Hugh of St. Victor and what he really brings to the Christian education tradition? I know it's a big topic. But.
Absolutely. Well, we can at least get started on it and maybe see where the rabbit trail takes us. But I will say I'm late to arrival on Hugh of St. Victor in terms of my life. I was classically educated in elementary, middle, and high school. I then went to college and shortly after graduating got into being an educator, mainly at first working with homeschool students, but then eventually working in classrooms at schools and now doing that online. And I still substitute at my son's classical Christian school as well. So I've been in this world for so long, and except maybe beyond a passing mention, I don't ever recall hearing about Hugh of St. Victor. It wasn't until I got to Nashotah House, so that was my third degree that I was working on in higher education, that Dr. Hans Boersma, who people may know, did a lecture on memory in medieval practice. And he had a large section about Hugh of St. Victor. And I was like, this guy sounds awesome. I need to go find out more about him. To help set the stage a little bit for Hugh, he lived in the 12th century, which was a super exciting time period. There was a lot of urbanization, and the kind of older institutions had begun to crumble a little bit. They had ossified a little bit. And so there was a lot of new things kind of on the emerging from just various necessity. It's often called the 12th century Reformation. There was a lot of kind of correcting some things that maybe had gone off, but also just exciting developments as the ball was pushed down the field in a lot of ways. And so, I mean, even Hugh and the community that he lived in at St. Victor, which was an abbey, but it was the canon regulars there had a very they were cloistered, but they also lived among people in a way that was, fairly innovative, I think. And they really did engage their larger community in a way that we don't often think of monastics doing. And so I think that's a really cool thing just right off the bat. But Hugh wrote a number of really important works. I think we would know more about Hugh if he wasn't sort of bookended by St. Anselm and St. Thomas Aquinas. I think he kind of gets overshadowed by the two of them. But in one of his works, St. Bonaventure, a couple years later, looking back at some of the medieval theologians who had come before, he kind of gives superlatives to different theologians. St. Thomas was a great systematic theologian, and he parallels them then with patristics, just like, such and such patristic scholar, and so was a really good biblical scholar, just like, Origen or something like this. And then at the end he says, but Hugh was a master of all of it. Hugh really was a Renaissance man. And so he wrote one of the first summas of theology, his De Sacramentis, which is a sort of sweeping theological survey. He begins with what he calls the works of foundation, or the works of creation, what we might think of as natural theology. And he says, every work that's not the scriptures pertains to the works of creation in some way. But the works of salvation are sort of the unique domain of the scriptures. And he has a very expansive definition of what the scriptures are, by the way. It includes not just the canonical books, but also the writings of church fathers and papal decretals and things like that. It's a very interesting, that's a whole other discussion, though.
Well, no, I mean, my own personal Christian tradition, not, a conversion later in life is Eastern Orthodox. So, being having a more expansive understanding of kind of sacred text and how it's layered, right? It's hierarchical. There's a core in it, from the Gospels moving on out. But yeah, anyway, we could get sidetracked in so many ways, but continue the survey of St. Hugh.
Yes. So that's kind of the foundation of De Sacramentis, but maybe his other best known work is called the Didascalicon, in which he lays out the blueprint for a liberal arts education from a Christian perspective. I mean, this is a scope and sequence that most of us would be lucky to have at the schools where we are administrators or teach at. I mean, it's really a brilliant work, and it's also not just pragmatic in terms of students should be studying X, Y, and Z and before they do A, B, and C and these kind of things, but rather there's I think a pretty robust pedagogical discussion that kind of underpins the whole thing. What exactly is the purpose of education, and how do these things lead, or what do these things lead to? And so for that reason, I felt really miffed that I hadn't heard about him way before. When I started my journey as a classical Christian educator, or even as a student, I thought I should have probably been exposed to some of his works. So I really, really love Hugh. I think he's very influenced by the liberal arts tradition, and you see that in a kind of humanism that he articulates, that the student is meant to be fully human. And I think we can carry a lot of those things over to the work that we do today, and should.
Yeah. That's great. because I talked to a lot of classical educators. I've seen a couple contact points, which is really heartening with St. Hugh's. I believe he's brought up in the Common Arts tradition with Chris Hall, and I believe the curriculum that he lays out includes some of the Common Arts. Is that something you're familiar with or have any thoughts about?
Yeah, Hugh really does. He does think that education should be expansive, and that an education should include not just what we would refer to as the liberal arts, but the other arts too. So he has a big discussion about the mechanical arts as well. I think there's kind of for him, and I think for most of us, when we talk about how these arts are related, right? We need to know some of these things just to survive. But then we have the liberal arts there so that we can be fully human, that we can go beyond mere survival. But at a certain point, they do come together, and even the mechanical arts, we might say, could be made beautiful, and so I think there's some room in Hugh for that. It's not an area that I'm as well versed in. I did recently have a discussion with a guy named Nathaniel Marshall, who he has a Substack, and I'm trying to remember what it's called, Blue Collar Scholar or something like that. He's a plumber, but he writes a lot, and he is a fantastic guy. And he found the mechanical arts section of the Didascalicon to be really fascinating and really applicable to his work as a plumber. And so he wrote a post about this a while ago that I don't have it on hand, but it was really cool. And he and I actually had a Zoom call where we talked about Hugh before he wrote it, and I really, really enjoyed that. So yeah, that he's like I said, a really true Renaissance man. I think.
Yeah,
that his curriculum would include that, and not just the liberal arts.
Yeah. That's exciting. Yeah, sounds like the author you're referring to, the Substack writer, would be kind of a kindred spirit to Christopher Hall. Should see if I can circle back and make that connection. I've heard Brian Williams as well at Eastern University, the head of the MAT program, is also a Hugh of St. Victor scholar, and has spoken about him several times. I think Brian has said that really classical Christian educators are essentially in the humanist tradition of Hugh of St. Victor. Like, that's the tradition we're in very specifically. And so he's made some great claims there. So this, I think there's a lot to be said. I'm glad Hans Boersma is making the connections at Nashotah House. And
yes,
I hope the cry goes out.
I got him back. I got Dr. Boersma back because I made him be my thesis advisor.
Oh, wow. I was going to ask what kinds of work you've done. So you actually wrote on Hugh for your thesis with Dr. Boersma.
Yes.
Wow.
Dr. Boersma was my advisor, and then a guy named Dr. Boyd Taylor Kuhlman was the reader. And Dr. Kuhlman, if you're interested in Hugh and you go to a library or you go to Amazon and you try to find a book about Hugh, there aren't very many of them. And one of the most recent ones is written by Dr. Boyd Taylor Kuhlman.
Wow, what an opportunity.
Yeah, so he's awesome. He's at Boston College. He's a big Victorine scholar. And so it was a lot of fun. It was a little nerve-wracking to have to defend it in front of those two, but it was really fun. So the thesis focused on Hugh's Christology and his sort of atonement theology, which goes beyond sort of mere satisfaction theory, though he does share that with like St. Anselm, and there's a lot to be said about that, and I think Hugh and Anselm both deal with that really beautifully. But there's something even further, which is that Hugh adds a layer of this sort of sapiential Christology, that wisdom came to destroy malice, which harkens again back to sort of the Christus Victor that you find in the Eastern Fathers, that Christ conquers the devil and things like that. But I love that he adds that idea of wisdom. And I think even beyond that, you find what is often referred to as sort of the moral example theory, which someone like Peter Abelard may be credited with, and the issue with Abelard isn't that he says that Christ is a moral example, but that sort of there's a kind of reductionism of the cross to sort of a pure moral example and nothing beyond that. And I think for Hugh, he's really wedding all three of these things together. So Christ, it becomes really important for us to know about the incarnation, because Christ is the template or blueprint for what it means for us to be fully human. And so if we want to be humanists, we have to understand who Christ is, because our definition of human doesn't start with us and then we say, well, Christ fits all these boxes, but rather that he is human and that everything else flows out of that. So whatever kind of human I'm called to be points should connect back to Christ rather than trying to connect Christ to the kind of human that I am now. And so that I think is really the foundation for his humanism, Hugh's humanism, is the incarnation itself, and of course, then its culmination of the cross.
Wow. Yeah, that's profound. I mean, that sort of transforms, the pagan classical tradition from the inside out, which is what Christian classical educators, continually doing. That's amazing. Let me shift to another topic I know we have some mutual interest in. I mentioned a recent conversation with Dr. Anika Prather, and this is something she's written about, advocated for, but a specifically American classical Christian education tradition. I've had conversations too with Kevin Clark, who's leader with Ecclesial Schools Network, and of course, author of Classical Academic Press's Liberal Arts Tradition, about a specifically American, tradition of classical education, what that would mean. Do you have thoughts on what it means for the classical Christian education tradition to, mature and take shape and be flourishing in a specifically American context?
Yeah, your question makes me think of the talk that Dr. John Mark Reynolds gave at the conference that we were talking about. I think his was called, what was it called? The Cosmological Canon, I think is how he referred to it, which was a brilliant title. But his argument was that, every family grows as it incorporates new members. So when your son marries a woman from another family, or your daughter marries a son from another family, you're sort of taking in that whole family into your family. And so your family has now expanded quite a bit. And so it would behoove you to kind of learn about the culture of your spouse's family, because you are now binding yourself to that. And he paralleled that to our school systems, that, when we have students in our schools, that they have a heritage, and that part of our education needs to speak to that particular heritage. And so he kind of made the argument that the canon of the sort of great books canon at one school may differ a little bit from another school. Of course, there will be essential core books, but he's founded schools in, like, I think he talked about founding a school in Georgia in Europe. And it's like, well, the kind of classics that they read there may be a little different. They may have room for more Georgian specific classics versus, needing to read some of the American classics. And so, so I think we should always have that view. I totally resonated with what he said in that talk, that there should always be a flexibility to reach the people that are there, that are in your sort of educational family. And so we have an obligation to those students, that they need to be well read in a particular tradition. He indicated that, as American students, like, we should all read the Book of Mormon. But, like, does someone from Georgia need to read the Book of Mormon? Probably not as much as we do, but it's certainly shaped American culture. And so, I think that we should do as much as we can to help students understand the culture in which they are enmeshed. And so that means reading American thinkers and American works, not at the expense or to negate the reading other works from other cultures. But there's certainly great literature here, and to understand the conversations and experiences that people have here, our students need to be immersed in that literature. I'm actually reminded of the first time we had Dr. Prather on the Classical Mind podcast. It was to talk about Frederick Douglass. This was years ago. And I remember when we uploaded the video to YouTube, there was actually sort of a negative reaction. We had garnered some listeners early on from around the world. They were sort of a global audience. And when we were talking about Frederick Douglass, there were not more than a few of them who said something like, well, I live in Brazil, or I live in, Europe somewhere. Why do I need to know about what Frederick Douglass said? And I thought that was a really interesting reaction from people who supposedly love classics.
Yeah, I
That
mean that Frederick Douglass is at a level, I would think of world culture. Some American classics probably are more for an American audience. People in the United States understanding our own story and our own history. But yeah, that is surprising.
Well, and that was one of
Um,
the answers that we gave was, yeah, this is essential for our story, but also there's a ton you can learn from Frederick Douglass, whether you're from Brazil or China or wherever else. Frederick Douglass is an enduring voice in the great conversation.
yeah,
Yeah, he's a
and
giant.
that's how a tradition. The purpose of a tradition is to receive, pass it on, and it's always a living thing. And Frederick Douglass is a standout example of someone who receives and then contributes to in response to what he's received. So yeah, what are some other classics that are American classics? You've mentioned the Book of Mormon feels to me like a sort of historical.
Yes.
I mean, it's a cultural, civilizational piece of the American story that no American should be ignorant of, unexposed to. But how about literary classics that you would think connect into the tradition, classical Christian tradition particularly well and resonate?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I do think American literature is a fantastic tradition. I used to teach when I was a teacher, classroom teacher. I taught a ninth grade American literature class that focused just on civil rights literature. Just because even in that sort of subgenre, there's so much to explore. Even then, I felt like we only scratched the surface. I mean, the students read Uncle Tom's Cabin, they read To Kill a Mockingbird, they read Booker T. Washington, but then they read W.B. Du Bois' response to Booker T. Washington. We read Frederick Douglass. I also tried to include a lot of the black poets in that class as well. And I think there was just a ton of material, and I wish we had had more time to be able to read even deeper. I wish we had been able to read James Baldwin like we just discussed with Dr. Prather. I thought that was such a fun episode to get into him. And so I definitely think reading from that particular tradition is really important. Dr. Prather loves to talk about the section from Du Bois about being invited to the table and sitting across from Socrates and Balzac and all these great thinkers and how they don't really judge him, and he's welcome to the conversation. But I do think there's a great appreciation for that. You read people like Du Bois, you read people like Baldwin, you read people like Huey Newton. I mean, they're all grounded in the classical tradition, and I think that's why their voices were so prophetic at the injustices that their community was facing in the United States, because they had this kind of humanism that they had received from the great tradition, and there was such a disparity between what was and still is in many ways and what they were experiencing. And so I think I think that that's a fantastic and prophetic tradition to read from. Outside of that, I think there's still other great American literature. I mean, I think some of my favorites are like I love uh, Billy Budd Sailor by Herman Melville is one of those ones that I read, I think, in high school, and it's really stuck with me, and I like to revisit from time to time. I don't know that enough people have read that or treat it with the seriousness that I think it deserves. So that's brilliant. Yeah. What about you? I'm sure you have some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of overlap. I mean, you could talk about literature, you could talk about theology. I think there's a lot in the well-ordered loves from some of the Puritan divines, even theologically. Among more recent authors, even there's just surprising ways in which you'll find interactions with Homeric literature, and Platonic philosophy and dialogue will show up in interacting with very contemporary writers on a regular basis, and these kinds of things I think are a great help to students to draw out and make the connections. Uh, uh, I'll refrain. I usually end up listing lots of books and making a lot of connections, but I won't try not to take up too much airtime with that. The some An area of teaching that you've done. I know you've taught some Latin, some logic. I'm wondering what kinds of overlap you find in being an educator and being a priest. What are some contact points between work with students and kind of spiritual guidance to folks Christian life.
Yeah, there's a ton there. It's a fertile overlap. In fact, I think it's helpful to go back to Hugh for a second because he's got this great line in the Didascalicon that where he's talking about that a student should learn everything well and later they'll see that nothing is superfluous. And so everything that a student does has some sort of supernatural end. Even if it doesn't feel like it, even if that's not super obvious at the time, there's still some way of equipping a person. So a really interesting way Hugh does this, I actually think, is with the three, the arts of the trivium, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric. And he kind of maps those onto the three senses of Scripture. So grammar is about learning to read what's on the page, the words themselves. Dialectic is learning to process the ideas. And then rhetoric is about being able to speak, being able to present those ideas, being able to understand them in a way that you can kind of almost make them your own. And for him, then, the three senses of Scripture are literal, allegorical, and tropological, or moral. So you learn what is this Bible story about? This Old Testament Bible story is about Israel. They get to this bitter water at Marah. They disobey God, so God has Moses to throw this tree into the water, and all of a sudden the water becomes sweet. That's a story about God providing for his people Israel in the wilderness, and so that's a great story. We can learn about God's nature through that. We can learn about being the people of God through that. But the allegorical, we're asked to process that text in a way that where is Christ in this? And so we can begin to understand that the bitter water is the law, and the sting of death that comes with that. And so God has Moses cast the tree into the water. Well, that's like the tree of the cross, which makes it sweet. That's the gospel. This is an Originian, reading of it. But then there's the moral. What does this text demand of me? In other words, now that I've processed how this text is about Christ, how does it then apply to me? And how does it change me? And so, it may be that that I need to bring those bitter things in my life to the cross so that they can be made sweet. And so what are those things? That requires a lot of self-examination and repentance and all those kind of things. But the beautiful thing is that there's a transposition of the allegorical into my life. So in our daily office as Anglicans, morning and evening prayer, we pray the prayer of thanksgiving at the end of the office. And it says that we might praise him not only with our lips, but in our lives. So when you teach a student the liberal arts of the trivium at the beginning of their education, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, and you work with them as they advance through their education and they continue to master those skills, you are paving the way for them to become readers of Scripture. And not only just readers of Scripture, but someone who's read Scripture so much that it becomes part of them and then it becomes expressed in their lives. And so as a teacher and a priest, I think you get to kind of see those connections real clearly of, we're teaching you this right now, but later you're going to see that it's not superfluous, that it's not pointless, that it does matter, that this is all about making you more human. And the kind of things you learn now are later going to pay dividends in terms of your, not only your maturity, not only your ability to live in the world, but in terms of your spiritual journey. And so that's, I think, one of the really cool benefits of being a teacher and a priest and getting to kind of speak to the whole student and not just the intellect, but their whole being.
Yeah, that's great. I love how that highlights really, what classical Christian educators talk about as distinctive of the classical Christian tradition is it's continually supposed to recognize that. And because of your, kind of combination of vocations, you get to see it, and it's great to hear you speak about it. So many teachers, I think, have a pastoral aspect. I mean, teachers recognize, that there's a pastoral aspect to just shepherding a classroom, but you literally get to see that.
Teaching is I do think teaching is a sacramental office. It's not a sacrament in the proper sense of the church, but there is something sacramental about it in which the teacher mediates between truth and the students and ushers them into the presence of truth, just like a priest stands in the place of Christ during the liturgy and brings the people up into that beautiful communion. So there's certainly resonances between the two jobs. There's a sense in which teachers and bartenders are both kinds of priests, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we have the priesthood of all believers, of course,
Exactly.
where that's a human thing to be a mediator, a point of hinge, joining or connecting, all the aspects of creation together. In a classroom, I think a teacher sometimes standing in the place of the students, like a priest would sometimes represent the congregation. And then at other times, the priest is representing Christ, speaking on behalf of Christ. And the teacher does that dual role of sometimes modeling a student and other times
Mhm.
modeling the great texts that are being read, and standing in both those places back and forth. Yeah.
I completely agree. Yeah. It's like, what do they say? The teacher is the text, and it's like the priest is the word in a sense. And so, yeah, but that doesn't mean the teacher is there yet, just like your priests aren't there yet. In fact, we need just as much, if
Yeah.
not more prayer
I
than
mean,
anybody else.
there's a sense in which teachers and priests are both, sort of non-entities at one level. I mean, they're the congregation and they're Christ to the congregation and, to Christ, but they're a contact point.
Yes, a
Yeah.
vessel. Yeah.
Yeah. Vessel. Yeah. So, where do you see the liberal arts shaping, the work and writings of the church fathers, or vice versa? What do the church fathers, you know, say about how do they alter or speak into the liberal arts? What are some standouts? I know that there's a wide variety. There's no, it's not a univocal kind of set of voices among the fathers. But what are some standout in either direction? The sort of influence the pagan liberal arts are picked up by and transformed, but also inform and shape theology.
So we're lucky. My parish is right outside of Annapolis, Maryland, and we have St. John's College right there. And so we've done some reading groups over at St. John's, and we have a number of students who come to the church and stuff. And so we try to have those relationships and build them. And of course, the best way to talk to Johnnies is by reading with them. And so, one place where I find a lot of really helpful contacts is actually one of our earliest Christian writers, which is Justin Martyr, and the way that he engages with the philosophers and clearly the liberal arts tradition. I mean, I think he's a fantastic example of what that looks like, of both extending a yes and a no. And I think all the fathers do this at times. Some of them are more severe than others, and some of that may be context more than anything. And I suppose if you even wanted to go back further, you could go back to St. Paul, who I think is immersed in the tradition enough to be aware of it. I mean, he's certainly immersed in the Greco-Roman milieu enough to quote their own poets back to them and all that. I think the speech at Athens is a great example of sort of appropriating the liberal arts tradition. But Justin Martyr does it very well as well. I mean, and of course, he thinks very highly of the philosophers like Plato. I mean, he goes so far as basically to call them Christians. And so you see, on the one hand, there's that. And then on the other hand, you're right, there is a sort of corrective that is offered through other fathers. Tertullian, is a little maybe more skeptical of the value that they have compared to Justin Martyr. And I'm thinking, Hugh, like I just mentioned, loves the liberal arts tradition. And I think he gets his love of it from St. Augustine, who had a similar, I think, view of the liberal arts, that what's true is true, and it's God's truth, and so whatever it is can be baptized, just like plundering the Egyptians in Exodus, and so I think he's another major voice in this, but I think that dynamic tension is always interesting, right? The way that they engage, there's always a yes. And sometimes that yes is much bigger than other times. It just depends on what it is you're reading and who you're talking to. But there is always sometimes a no that has to be extended as well. There are ways in which the gospel inverts things. So I actually have a pet theory. I don't know if you're ready for this yet or not. I don't know if I'm ready to defend this yet or not. But I think St. Mark's gospel is based on the Odyssey. It is, the main reason I think this is that there are times where, when Jesus performs a miracle and he then tells people, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. And then, of course, he does eventually reveal who he is at the end of the gospel when he's on trial. And as a result, he's slaughtered. And this, of course, I actually was teaching through the Odyssey while I was preaching through Mark through the lectionary one year. And it kind of hit me that there's this weird, because when Odysseus gets back to his home, he is disguised and he tells everyone, don't tell anyone who I am. Don't tell anyone who I am. And eventually he reveals himself. But when he reveals himself, of course, he slaughters the suitors of his wife who have been eating his food and mooching off of his house. And I think that's a great picture of, if it's true that Mark is based on the Odyssey. Maybe you're skeptical, I don't know, but it would certainly explain the messianic secret, which has baffled a number of scholars who have tried to figure that out. When Jesus reveals himself and he's slaughtered as a result of it, the Greek heroic tradition has been totally inverted. And this is what Christianity often does to the pagan culture. Yes, there's absolutely, there's something true about this. Let me show you what that means. And it ends up turning the thing inside out.
Yeah. Flipping it over. I mean, I feel like I can't think of the name right now, but I feel like I've read some scholars who make that case. Have you come across anyone who defends that?
There's one that I know of named Dennis MacDonald.
Okay.
Who is at Claremont. He's retired now. His undergrad, he went to Bob Jones University, and then he went off to like Harvard, I think. Very much not a fundamentalist now.
Yeah.
And we actually had him on an early episode of The Sacramentalist to kind of talk about this. I, of course, proposed to him the idea that, there's the Christianity's the true myth, so of course these things are, and he told me that was very arrogant for me to think that. But so he has a couple books about the Odyssey and Mark. So I'm glad I'm not alone, at least.
Yeah, I think that's the name I was recalling. That's a provocative thesis for sure, but fascinating. I mean, the widespread nature of the Homeric material in terms of like just basic education for at a pretty young age is hard to overstate. I mean,
and we know that they were used to help teach people how to read and speak Greek. And we're pretty sure, based on the Greek, that Mark was not a native Greek speaker, because the Greek is a little rough. So it's quite possible that this was a story that he would have been very familiar with, because he was kind of new to the Greek language, or it was an acquired language. So he would have maybe been exposed to the story. And it was just culturally pervasive anyways.
Yeah,
I mean, it was their national origin story. So of course he would have been exposed to it in some way.
Yeah, an effective way to communicate key truths.
If you're trying to reach the Gentiles, and the Greeks in particular, why wouldn't you use their founding narrative in some way?
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm curious if you're reading anything, new, or listening to anything new these days. I was just listening, actually, a couple of days ago, a very recent lecture by Paul Kingsnorth, his 2024 Erasmus lecture that he gave, First Things Gathering, reading a book, All Things Are Full of Gods, David Bentley Hart, Philosophy of Mind text. I'm wondering if we share any kind of common ground with anything we're listening to or reading. What's kind of catching your attention among contemporary materials?
I think we are very much on the same page there. All Things Are Full of Gods. I'm reading it. You're probably, I think, because you're in like a reading group about it, right?
Yeah, I just finished it about a week ago. So you're still plowing. It's like 500 page.
Yeah, I think I'm about 150, 175 pages in right now. But man, it's so good. I really love David Bentley Hart and pretty much every book he's written. But there's a part of me, and maybe it's just because it's new, or maybe it's because of the way it's structured, like a Socratic dialogue or something. But I do think this might be his best book so far.
Yeah, I'll be curious what kind of further reviews we get, but there's been a couple that are rather effusive. James Matthew Wilson in World Magazine, I think, was really over the top in his praise of the book. But yeah, it's a big commitment to read, and I certainly can't claim to have followed all of it. It covers a lot of different topics and a lot of territory with philosophy of science and philosophy of language.
Yes.
But yeah, I have a feeling it might be his most impactful as far as sort of a cultural contribution, kind of a challenge to the status quo, in terms of our way of thinking of what's real as a society. It's a pretty ambitious sort of counter case that he's putting forward there. But
I appreciate the recovery of a kind of idealism. I think that's a really cool move on his part, and I'm excited to see what fruit that will bear in terms of the larger discussions that we have culturally about mind and matter and all these things. I certainly think this will be a force to be reckoned with in terms of the conversation moving forward. You'll have to engage it in some way, I think.
And just insisting that there's that there's a meaning, and putting that directly into engagement with science is such a gutsy thing to do. But to say that the sciences ultimately can't be done, and he sort of inverses the order of the sciences, so that we think of as physics as most basic, and he says no, it's the sciences of life, biology and ecology, that actually allow us to understand and explain physics. And some of these like really basic moves that he makes are just feel so reorienting and reinvigorating. But
what's interesting, as you're talking about this, I was thinking about a lecture I just listened to recently, but on the Thomistic Institute podcast, which I listen to pretty regularly, and they were talking about how when Darwin's Origin of Species came out, Huxley's review of it was praising it because he brought teleology back into the sciences. It had been sort of absent, and he brought it back, which I thought was very interesting and very contrary to some of the critiques that you hear about evolution sometimes, that it actually does bring a kind of teleology back into our way of thinking, if we think about it properly anyways. So yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, I really am enjoying it. I have actually finished a lot of other reading that I was doing, and so I might be able to plow through All Things Are Full of Gods now, but we'll see. It's so dense; it's hard to read more than 20 or 30 pages in a sitting.
No, it's a slow go for sure. Yeah,
It
and
is.
like a lot of his books, I know that I'm only getting a percentage of it. But another area, I think classical Christian educators should be thinking a lot about just kind of the big arc of the human story and the Christian story, and engaging with contemporary society. Are there any standout? I really enjoyed the Paul Kingsnorth lecture that I mentioned, and I'm always kind of thinking about and trying to recommend things that I think are great examples of engagement with what American history, Christian civilization, these kinds of topics that are really deeply integrated with the questions of classical Christian education, and what is the heritage that we're receiving and sustaining and renewing, whatever words might be appropriate to use there. But are there any resources, standout articles or podcasts, related to some of the, these are fraught topics. I mean, they're not. We're recording right now, right around election day, and all of this. not easy things to talk about. But what's helpful in your experience among kind of contemporary resources?
As you were talking, I was thinking about other things I was reading,
Hmm.
which aren't exactly, I wouldn't call them resources for classical Christian educators necessarily,
Well,
but things that intersect with what we're talking about and with this sort of tr- um, transmission of the classical tradition. So I
yeah.
just finished reading a novel that I think is I remember hearing a lot about it when it came out, and I haven't heard a ton of discussion since. But Christopher Beha's The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. Are you familiar with this?
No.
Oh, I read it. It came out in 2020, and I read it
Okay.
then, and then I just listened to it again as an audiobook. But I was enjoying it so much, I forced my wife to go borrow it from the library and read it, and I think she'll probably finish it today or tomorrow, hopefully. But it's a fantastic kind of look at I think it's sort of a cultural analysis, but also a kind of maybe not blueprint for recovery, but maybe a sort of longing for recovering that great tradition. The basic story is that it follows kind of two main characters. One is a guy named Frank Doyle, who was a sort of William Buckley-esque commentator on culture, and the other is a guy named Sam Wexworth, who is a statistician, sort of a Nate Silver type. He predicts every state and then every down ballot, like gubernatorial and congressional race in an election year, the Obama election year. And so he gets promoted to this big magazine in New York City, moves to the big city from Wisconsin. And one of his jobs is to do a profile on this William Buckley-esque figure who's been canceled because he's a big Mets fan, and they invite him up to the up to the broadcaster booth during a game, and he says some racially insensitive things about the former president. And so Sam has to do this report about it. They both love baseball, but for entirely different reasons. The older gentleman, the William Buckley guy, loves the sort of liturgy of baseball and the mythos of baseball and the way that it informs American culture and all this. Whereas the statistician loves the sabermetrics. He loves the predictability. He loves all this. And so they have a sort of clash about, well, what really matters in baseball, and is it just numbers, or is there something more to a baseball game than just what's on the stat sheet at the end, and all these kind of questions come up. But also, it's called the Index of Self-Destructive Acts because that's an actual statistical category for when a pitcher hits batters, when they walk batters, when they wild pitches and balks, I think. So that's the Index of Self-Destructive Acts. But the characters in the story, from their worldviews, engage in certain self-destructive acts. So Sam, with his very materialist, very mathematical worldview, makes certain mistakes that kind of ruin his life at points. And the William Buckley guy, Frank, he makes different kinds of mistakes, and the other characters in the book all make mistakes too. So it's a really great novel. I really enjoyed it. It's one of those ones that I mean, it's hard for us to say what will be a classic, 100 years, 250 years down the road, but I could see that one surviving because I think it was really excellent.
But it really brings. I'm not familiar with it. Now you've definitely intrigued me. It sounds like it brings some really basic questions for classical educators, kind of contemporary approaches to life and to education into, contact point and kind of a wrestling match almost with more, traditional or conservative approaches. And it's not necessarily sort of taking one side or the other. But
yeah. I think the book is sort of humanist insofar as it's pointing out the ways in which we dehumanize others, and of course the mathematical worldview. It's very easy to do that because you treat people like numbers instead of human beings. But I think the other worldviews that are represented can also be guilty of similarly dehumanizing behaviors. This actually then connects to another thing that I've started reading recently, and he's maybe a little controversial at times, but the Pope just released a new encyclical called Dilexit Nos, which is about the Sacred Heart, and even as I was reading that novel, I was thinking about that phrase "men without chests," which
Yeah,
I've heard a
C.S.
lot.
Lewis's phrase.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we talk about it a lot in classical Christian circles. And
yeah,
I think what the Pope is doing in that letter is really brilliant, because it's about bringing it back to the heart, and we find that in the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And so I think that kind of meditation is going to be a really helpful way forward of, again, treating the person as a whole being. And so he begins with a great discussion about what is the heart and what is the significance of the heart and all this. And he talk about being grounded in the classics, begins with a discussion of the heart in the Homeric epics and in Greek culture and philosophy, Plato, Socrates, etc. So it's really cool. I've really enjoyed reading that so far. I'm not very far into it, but I like what is happening with it. And I think those are the kind of resources that, while maybe we don't have a firm catalog of things right now, those are the kinds of things that we
yes,
should be looking for. Because it's very easy, and like you said, we're in an election season, and so there's a lot of dehumanizing rhetoric about them, whoever they are to you. And I think classical Christian education should always be reminding us that it's never that simple, that it's never so dichotomous, and that at the end of the day, the way we treat other people comes back on ourselves. If we dehumanize other people, we're actually dehumanizing ourselves. Whereas if we treat them with humanity and dignity and all these things, then we're becoming who we're supposed to be. And so, yeah, I think those are the kinds of things we need to be seeking out and very intentionally consuming, rather than a 24/7 news cycle that's very toxic and otherizing.
yeah. Well, when I use the term resources, that's exactly the kinds of things I was looking for. Things that are coming out right now that are relevant to classical, the classical Christian renewal, that tied together issues that we're facing every day, issues that our students are aware of and would recognize with, I love your example of, the Homeric understanding of the human heart. What a rich way to thread things together, and continually reminding myself of the fact that, like, it's Solzhenitsyn, I think, who said, the line between good and evil, doesn't run between one group of people and another, but right down the middle of every human heart.
That's right. I think I remember hearing a story about in England in the early 1900s. They sent a questionnaire to intellectuals about what's wrong with the world, and so many people waxed eloquent about whatever the problems were. And G.K. Chesterton's response was 2 words: "I am."
Yeah. He's amazing, the way he could just reframe the conversation with a simplicity that's profound. So beautiful. Well, thank you so much. This was amazing. Any other final thoughts or questions or things I didn't bring up that you're hoping to chat about with a Classical U audience and teachers who are working hard every day and serving students in Christian classical schools?
Nothing that I had on my list of things, other than just to say thank you for all of your work and having these conversations and broadcasting them and helping those folks who are in the trenches. It's really, really awesome to have these kind of resources, and very thankful for Classical Academic Press and all that work and that you all do. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to have educators like yourself who are, also sharing podcast material and just engaging the topic from their churches, from their schools, and it's been a real delight just personally to get to talk to you. We do have a lot of things, reading and loves that we overlap in. So thanks so much, Father Wesley.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Classical U's podcast. Thank you for tuning in. We release podcast episodes once a month with our presenters. Please also check out our live learning events, webinars in collaboration with Skole Academy and Skole Communities.